Once it is done, then this principle of selection works. Mind select judiciously only those feelings which are commonly catering to the larger benefit of humanity. And when the mind keeps on or makes it the part of its habit to select judiciously only those particular feelings which are going to be relevant for the larger concern of the humanity, then once it becomes a habit of the mind by repetition or by continuation of this act, then the feelings finally are connected with the most important subjects. Now, here there's a catch. Don't you think that there is some sort of a direct attack on all those neoclassical poets that have laid emphasis on or that have selected their poetic subject something of a very trivial in nature? For example, Rape of the Lock. Isn't it a direct attack on Alexander Pope's selection of this subject as well? What about the mind of this man who has not been so judicious in his selection of the right poetic subject, and what all he is talking of is nothing but a woman, a particular lock of a woman, and how it was being, ripped off from the skull, and how because of someone's ego war or because of a group of families that were involved or because of the ego war between these families, how this entire thing becomes a poetic subject. This is so trivial in nature in itself. How can triviality enter the poetic subjects in the first place? How can such levels of triviality or such levels of futility enter or become the part of poetic aesthetics? That was a big question mark on the part of Mr. Wordsworth. And this is the reason he particularly says that only those subjects are taken up, only those general representative feelings are taken up that are really important to men. And this mind, by its continuation of this act of judiciously selecting up those feelings only which are important for the larger humanity, these feelings can understand what important subjects under earth exist, right? Now, after understanding these concepts, once we make the reading of the next paragraph or continue with with these next lines, now it will make sense to you. So let me start with the textual reading and I'll continue from the last one. That is, for all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and though this be true, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects, but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. Now comes a part whose explanations were given earlier, in today's material that was posted. For our continued influxes of feeling are modified and directed by our thoughts. So human beings, it's not that we are static beings, we are continuously in flux, we are continuously in space flux. That is, we are dynamic beings. We are never being stopped or being static at one moment where our thoughts cease to exist. The thoughts and feelings, they are continuously erupting. So the feelings, Wordsworth says, the feelings, they are always in influx. They are always dynamic in nature. But it is the brain, or it is the part of that brain called mind, or it is the thoughts that finally judiciously makes a selection. And let's reread it from the text. For our continued influxes of feeling are modified and directed by our thoughts, which are indeed the representatives of all our past feelings. So whatever past feelings have gone by, these thoughts, with the help of brain makes a judicious selection, a judicious choice, a judicious, thoughtful selection of all these past feelings, and these past feelings somewhere majorly becomes representatives. How? So if I ask you, when you were 5-year-old and your birthday was being celebrated by your parents, I'm sure you cannot recall all the information, all the factual information that happened during those times. What you'll remember at best would be the feeling that was generated, and your mind will ensure that whatever best feeling that came, or the most dominating feeling that existed on your first or your fifth birthday that was celebrated, that dominant feeling would be supplied, would be quickly given up, from your cerebral part, right? So it could be also a feeling of being annoyed at one of your friends or being annoyed at one of your relatives. So how do we recall particular memories? It is by this selection, this judicious selection by the mind of certain feelings, and finally they give rise to certain selected one, which becomes, these selected ones become the representative feelings of all those of all the combined ones. Let's reread it. For our continued influxes of feeling are modified and directed by our thoughts, which are indeed the representatives of all our past feelings, and as by contemplating the relation of these general representatives to each other, that is, these general representatives, broadly the class of feelings that are now, judiciously being selected and grouped by the brain. Now, by contemplating the relation of these general class of feelings to each other, we discover what is really important to men. And then, by its repetition and continuation of this act, our feelings become connected with important subjects till at length, and we stop it here. So I hope till here, we stop it here for the moment. I hope till here, few concepts that I've gone into, that I've already explained, that the mind selects all those, that principle of selection is done on the basis of which feelings best represent for the larger benefit of humanity. This is done by the mind, and this judicious principle of selection done by the mind is done from the collection of past feelings. These past feelings then represent certain feelings, certain class of feelings, as the mood of joy, or not just the mood, the feelings of joy, the feelings of enthusiasm, the feelings of annoyance. And when these representative class of feelings are brought together, then how is this subject decided? Whatever is the best possible one for humanity, that is selected one, and that becomes a subject matter. Now let's continue with the reading. So we left it till here. Our feelings will be connected with important subjects. We discover what is really important to men. So by the repetition and continuation of this act, our feelings will be connected with the most important subject. So till here we have discussed. Now let's proceed further with the reading. So I'm quoting from the text now. Till at length, if we be originally possessed of much sensibility, such habits of mind will be produced, that by obeying blindly and mechanically the impulses of those habits, we shall describe objects and utter sentiments of such a nature and such a connection with each other, that the understanding of the reader must necessarily be in some degree enlightened and his affectations strengthened and purified. Again, a lot of theorization has gone into it. Conceptually dense paragraph, but let's make an attempt to understand it. Now he says, till at length we be originally possessed of so much sensibility. Now we be possessed. He's not referring to we as in general we, people as in classes or masses. No. Here he particularly refers to we be as referring to the poets only. So this selection of feelings, or this class of feelings which are judicially selected, sagaciously selected by the mind, and that forms the basis of the subject matter, which is entirely based on whether or not it is important for the humanity. Now once it is done, we poets must learn to possess such sensibility. And what is that sensibility? This sensibility is the poet's hyper-acute perceptions and experience. This sensibility, we must possess this sensibility. We must be somewhere better than, we must be somewhere ahead of the normal people, the common men and women, the common folks. How our sensibilities, our perceptions, our experiences towards objects should be hyper-acute. By this he means a yellow daffodil which is in its full bloom during the spring season, it may appear or it may soothe someone who's watching it and experiencing its fragrance and feeling good about it. So this is just the very ordinary level of receiving it. Rather, we should have this ability of imagination and we should have this hyper acute perception. How does this hyper acute perception takes place? With the habits of contemplation in past. If you remember in the very first description of I think when we were talking of contemplation and imagination, he said that because I have been into this habit of contemplation, because I've been into this habit of meditation in the sense of thinking at longer stretch, because the poet is in the habit of contemplation, this sensibility or this degree of sensibility is achieved. So if you notice, he's a kind of poet who is very, very much determined to augment, to widen this sphere of human sensibility. And how is he doing it? He's trying to again empower, he's trying to strengthen a human being with an apostrophe S, human being's capacity for the contemplative response towards an object. So don't you think someone who is so well able to look through things, especially nature objects, so well, so deeply, as if the person is seeping through that object clearly? Don't you think because of this kind of acute understanding, because of this kind of acute imagination, he was rightly called a high priest of nature? Later day critics have described him as the high priest of nature, and it was for this reason. The reason was his poetry was founded on the deepest instincts of nature that he could find. That is why in one of the very earliest recordings, in one of the very earliest audio lectures, I've deliberately talked about how he was regarded as a nature poet. He was primarily a prominent poet of the thoughtful and the spiritual. In other words, what he's trying to say is, by this particular line from the text, that is, where has the line gone? Okay, I've myself lost. We be originally possessed of much sensibility. We, here referring to the class of poets, we should be ideally possessed of much sensibility. That is, we should ideally have this sensibility, this huge expanded range of imagination as well as passion, that this passion makes this sensibility creative and thereby heightens the impact of natural objects on the observer, on the reader, right? So now comes the interplay, now comes the role of the reader next. Why the reader is so important. Now we move on to the next line, and the description of the next line, or the primary idea of the next line, is he says that only when the poet has inculcated this habit of meditation, which ultimately disciplines his feelings, that good poets can be made. And these good poets can only be made by deep, habitual, sustained contemplation. Why? Because once you have inculcated this habit of deep contemplation, then the mind would, out of habit, out of blindly obeying, or mechanically, due to that bondage of those habits, it will describe objects in such a manner that the reader's perception, the reader, when they read it, when they read about the object which you as a poet have described, when they read it, their affections, they are strengthened, they are purified, and they are enlightened. Now let's dwell more on the role of reader, and what does he mean exactly by readers get enlightened, their affections get strengthened and purified. These are the terms I'm talking, and I'm taking directly from the text itself. So keep your text open when we are having this discussion through the audios. Now, before I describe more about the role of reader, few things as readers is quite apparent and understood. One is that poetry is the transmission of the poet's emotion. The poet's emotion, whatever it is, even if it involves the intellectual truth or taking up the rules and techniques of poetry, of even if neoclassicism or previous to neoclassicism, whatever it is simply the transmission of poet's emotion. Now, listen to it very carefully, unless the reader is sentimental or philosophical in exactly the same way as the poet is, any hope for communication will fail. Reason being the triviality or silliness from the reader's point of view, right? So unless the reader is on the same tangent philosophically at which the poet is, it is very, very easy to assume that he won't understand the right context. Without that context, he won't understand poetry. For example, if you decidedly give Paradise Lost to a lay person, chances are after maybe 5 to 10 pages, he'll be turned off and he won't read it again, ever. And if you compare it with the literature students, who is somewhere after understanding the poetic theory, or after understanding the aesthetics or the aesthetic system of a particular poet, they can relate it better. They can understand and make that tangible connection better, right? So in other words, one of the goals of any poet, or one of the goals of the poetic experience, should be the coupling of the poet with the reader. What makes the poet important for the reader is that the poet is in touch with higher reality, or at least in touch with the important truths. Why? Because it is idly believed that the poet occupies, or the poet exhibits, or the poet has already a hyper acute sense of perception and experiences and passion towards things and imagination, which a lay person does not have, right? May not have completely. So somewhere here the role of the poet becomes that because the poet is in touch with higher reality, or the poet has an idea about important objective truths of life, or important truths of the existence, he or she, the poet, can relate to these, or at least convey through his experiences of writing. It is again the poet's job to utilize his more intimate connection with the nature to ultimately correct human beings' feelings. Why? Because the poet is already in touch with the higher reality. The poet is already occupying or having an acute sense of perception. And if he can see certain things, the common reader which he cannot, at least he can become the medium. He can become the channel, and through his poetry, the medium is of course the poet, and the channel is of course the poetry, or other way around also it's possible. So the channel and medium, the poet and poetry, becomes a means by which the poet can convey their important truths, the higher reality. And that is why this higher reality can ultimately rectify men's feelings, men with an apostrophe S, men's feelings, and it may give them new compositions of feelings or new set of feelings, and it may ultimately render their feelings more sane, more purified, more permanent, more enlightened, right? In short, more in consonant to nature, that is to eternal nature, and of course the great moving spirit of things. This is what exactly is the poet talking about. Let's reread it from the text. If you have not understood the same concept, please listen to the audio again, and then you'll be able to relate with the text better. Then it will be crystal clear. So I'm making the reading from the text now. Till at length we be originally possessed of so much sensibility that such habits of minds will be produced by obeying blindly and mechanically the impulses of those habits. That is the same habits of contemplation which ultimately discipline those feelings. Those feelings are so well disciplined because of those habits that when the poet sees particular objects, it blindly comes out to his acute sense perception and he can jot it down. We shall describe objects and sentiments of such a nature in such a connection with one another that the understanding of the reader must necessarily be in some degree enlightened, his affection strengthened and purified. So this is here he says that it is the poet's duty to utilize his deep connection with the nature. It is the poet's job to utilize his deep intimate connection with nature to ultimately rectify human beings' corrupt feelings, or to give them new set of feelings, or to give them new compositions of feelings, so that to render their feelings more sane, pure and permanent. In short, if I take the example of it, before reading about the particular poem, say for example daffodils, how many of you have viewed the same flower with the same intensity, with the same sense perception? And after you have read daffodils, after you have read how he almost with his sense of imagination, he sees the way these daffodils are dancing, they somewhere reflect the dancing or the joy which was missing in the city life, and how joyful or how joyous they are in the rustic life or in the countryside. So for him it becomes a symbol of something, a symbol of happiness, right? So before giving a quick reading of daffodils or a deeper reading of daffodils, how many of you were aware about that this simple flower, a yellow colored looking flower, which is so beautiful, and it comes out in its full bloom during the springtime, can convey so many feelings at the same time by using simple imagination, right? And you'll find this stretch of romanticism even in later age romantics. Take the example of Lord Tennyson when he describes the poem, the simple 5 or 6 line poem Eagle. Look at the kind of metaphors he has read. He's again somewhere romanticizing that a simple creature like eagle can encompass so much power, and he symbolically and with full connotations he describes using his own imagination how ultimately the way normal human beings view or watch eagle, they are very different from how he has described it. Lord Tennyson has described it, right? So ultimately, poetry, as per Mr. Wordsworth, is not at all the transmission of the things in themselves. Rather, it is the poet's experience of these things to the readers. We are going to begin with the reading of the next paragraph. That is, it has been said that each of these poems has a purpose. Although we have taken the particular lines from this paragraph to explain our point earlier when we were talking about Alexander Pope and Wordsworth and their essential differences of the aesthetic system, but let's give it another reading. And I am reading from the text directly. It has been said that each of these poems has a purpose. Another circumstance must be mentioned which distinguished these poems from the popular poetry of the day. It is this, that the feeling therein developed gives importance to the action and situation, and not the action and situation to the feeling. Now this exactly I was expecting that you'll post as answer when I gave the question of what factor existed or what factors were specially mentioned by Wordsworth when it comes to distinguishing between his poetry or the collection in lyrical ballads in comparison to the neoclassical poets or general poets of the day. I was expecting that you'll clearly mention this line, that feeling therein develop gives importance to the action and situation and not the action and situation to the feeling. That was being taken up. The question was deliberately taken up from these lines. I don't know how many of you have mentioned it, but I'm a bit disappointed with most of the people copying from internet, especially from some of the blogs that have simply put that have actually simplified Wordsworth's poetic theory into some 3 or 4 stages of observation and recalling and filtering and so on and so forth. Well, when I first read it, as the comment made by some of them, I was quite impressed. I thought this is your observations and these are your particular theorization, what you have understood. But when I saw people were repeating this, and there was just 6-7 people who made the same write up, then I was sure that it has been copied from some source. And when I found out it, I found that a couple of blogs it has been copied from, who have done nothing but again the simplification or probably the oversimplification of this theory, especially of using these terms of observation, filtering, and recalling, and so on and so forth. Have you ever seen anywhere Wordsworth has used it, or in any of my recordings I have mentioned about observation, filtering, and so on and so forth? If not, that means there must have been some reason. Please do not simplify this aesthetic theory what Wordsworth gave into your own words, especially copying from some sources. Some of the students have written it in their own words. They were brilliant, and let me have some time and I'll point it out and write it in the announcement who were all the ones who have wrote the best answers, but certainly not the ones who have copied from these blog spots. Okay, so let's proceed further with the reading. From the next paragraph, I'll move directly to the 4th or 5th line, that is, the subject is indeed important. The subject is indeed important, for the human mind is capable of being excited without the application of gross and violent stimulants, and he must have a very faint perception of its beauty and dignity who does not know this, and who does not further know that one being is elevated above another in proportion as he possesses this capability. Now, what he means here is human mind is capable of more than something called crude or gross. Human mind is capable of more than crude and excitement. We are, unlike animals, endowed with this ability to intellectually engage or to make sense of or to make perceptions of certain things, of our surroundings. Unlike the animals who have this ability to find normal joy in the crude and in the gross, right? They cannot think beyond these levels upon which human beings can. So he clearly says here, he clearly implies that while the gross and violent stimulants, they stir the ordinary feelings, the ordinary human feelings, poetry awakens a contemplative response, and therefore, or thereby, it exercises a sensibility of the reader. It takes the reader into higher sensibilities. So is he talking of, or is he talking about taking the reader to some higher levels of sensibilities, or in other words, transcendentalism? It's not yet confirmed. It has not yet been verified. Why? Because in order to have the experience of transcendentalism, the readers must be within the same bandwidth, within the same framework in which Wordsworth originally wrote. Right? So his own aesthetic system, the readers, when they're reading through his poetry, they must be within that same bandwidth. Again, as I said, bandwidth, and they must be upon the same wavelength to understand what's what transcendentalism was all about. Right? But he certainly means that one has to rise above these crude and basic and primordial levels of getting excited by something which is gross, or which is something which is having a basic description of gross, or which is very crude in nature, right? And poetry, again I'm repeating, poetry is usually born in contemplation, and as per Mr. Wordsworth, it is in the meditative recollection of a feeling that is recalled from the past, or that is summoned from the past. A great poet should always raise people up to his own level rather than descend into theirs. or if the sensibility of the poet is truly creative, is truly innovative, is truly, in words of or in a kind of indirect explanation of Wordsworth, is truly transcendentalist, then he's not just a simple reflector of human feelings. He's rather almost like a new star in the firmament, brightly generating an emotive power of his own, right? He uses this imaginative exertion or imagination conferred on simple objects and makes use of this imagination and ultimately reaches or tries to reach the poetic truths or the intellectual poetic truths. And the next line that he says is that it therefore appears to me, or it has therefore appeared to me, that this kind of endeavor to produce or to enlarge or to augment or to expand this capability, this human sensibility, is one of the best services. Excellent at all times, and it is especially so at the present day. Why at the present day? Because since England and the neighboring countries were already undergoing a lot of change, and this ordeal of change was not easily acceptable by the civilians as well. There were a lot of challenges that were faced at the civilian level too. So at the present day, he clearly means that the idea behind introducing poetry is also to expand, or to use Wordsworth's word, to produce and enlarge this capacity or capability, that is human sensibility, is one of the best services. That's the same line I'm taking up from the text. And then after again a few lines, he criticizes this same outrageous way of laying emphasis on external actions, external situations, external events. How? After few lines, you'll find this particular one, the invaluable works of our elder writers. That is exactly after 8 or 9 lines. The invaluable works of our elder writers, I had almost said that the works of Shakespeare and Milton are driven into neglect by frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse. Extravagant stories in verse may be a reference to the neoclassical times, and of course it's a reference to the mock epic tradition of the neoclassical times. And then further he says, when I think upon this degrading thirst after outrageous stimulation. Why? Because you're looking outside for this stimulation, how you can stimulate your mind and ultimately write down the poetry. Whereas, as per Mr. Wordsworth, it is a feeling developed thereupon these events and actions and outside situations, that upon this feeling, the poetry or the poetic composition should be made. And another reason he gives why this kind of lethargy that exists on the parts of the poets to look for inspiration from outside and not place any importance to the feelings generated on it, or just mechanically with the use of certain rules, how they have artificially devised these external events through the verse form. He says this, and that's exactly the middle of this paragraph, which I think we have missed these lines. Let me read it again. And the reason was, there had been a multitude of reasons, there had been a multitude of causes that has made the human mind be busy with almost savage lethargy and look for external events or outside events to be taken as inspiration for writing down the verse. And I'm taking these lines from the text. For a multitude of causes unknown to the former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion, to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. Now let's break it first. For a multitude of causes, and of course it is referring to the outside events, outside multitude reasons that were taking shape, or multitude of turmoil, political turmoil, civil turmoil, or the strife that was taking place between England and France. So all these reasons they are the part of the multitude causes unknown to former times. They were not known to former times. For a multitude of causes are now acting uh, with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind. They are actually making the powers of mind as to be discriminating and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion, to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. Torpor means a state of lethargy, a state of no action, non-action. So the mind is not really engaged into this kind of activity where you look for something, or where you look for or explore through, rummage through your feelings, or rummage through simply the diction or the poetic terms that exist. Or on the other hand, you look for outrageous external stimulation. And I'm taking these words directly from the text, these phrases from the text itself. Rather, there was this bent towards outrageous stimulation from the outside that I'm almost ashamed to have spoken of the feeble endeavor made in these volumes to counteract it, and reflecting upon the magnitude and general evil. I should be oppressed with no dishonorable melancholy had I not a deep impression of certain inherent and indestructible qualities of the human mind, and likewise of certain powers in the great and permanent objects that act upon it. Now here clearly he is emphasizing the role and importance and need and relevance of mind, human mind, which is an indestructible entity, which has indestructible qualities, inherent and indestructible qualities, and which has been for a long time kept on a savage torpor, has been kept on a deliberate savage or very brutal lethargy. Now this is again very much the part of tradition of British literature, where after a certain age, after certain eras, almost all critics and poets, they keep on ranting about the credits, the rules and the regulations of the previous age that has gone into. So if there was this times where Shakespeare and Elizabethan sonnet traditions have been existing, or Elizabethan sonnet writers or sonnet tradition, or the poets have been writing it, then of course there was this stage of critics who criticized this overt emphasis, or they criticized bluntly of this tradition of Petrarchan sonnet, or imitating this Petrarchan sonnet. The best example probably of Stephen Gosson, and to which Philip Sidney came out his defense of poetry. So every age you'll find some of the critics and poets ranting against the previous age poets, and the rules and the poetic techniques that they have been adopting or they have been using in their particular poems or the poetries at large. So this is where again Mr. Wordsworth very much into this tradition of following it. Although, let me tell you, critics of the latter day have also dismissed his theory. They say that this is nothing but a self-expression theory. So his poetry becomes a kind of sideshow, or probably a photography exhibition, accomplishing nothing more than the display of the poet's various attitudes. For example, this is me looking at the Westminster Abbey. This is me standing next to the pyramids. This is me at the Tinton Abbey. This is me at the Taj Mahal. So if we do not share the poet's evaluation of the attitudes themselves, then the exhibition fails. Right?